Ned Roche, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this session that's going to be a very important lecture, obviously, or talk, I should say, and then a discussion following it on a topic, a series of topics that are of utmost importance. So the session is about Iran, the Arab Spring, and U.S. imperialism, and Goudarz also said he would address how all of that relates to the issue of Palestine. We are very fortunate to have Goudarz Eghtedari, who is going to be our presenter this afternoon. He's a political analyst, writer, human rights advocate, radio producer, voicesofthemiddleeast.com, and peace activist by choice, and an engineer and educator by profession. He has a PhD in systems science from PSU and has taught at Portland State and the University of Phoenix. For any of you who have caught his show on KBOO, it's a great example of what humanitarian, a person from the heart, a political analyst, and a very savvy sort of organizer around really some of the most important issues of our day, and certainly around all issues around the Middle East. So I feel honored to be able to introduce a friend, a colleague, and a fellow activist. Please welcome Goudarz.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to sit because I want to have an access to my iPad, which I put in some notes.
Let me just ask, can everybody hear? Move the microphone closer.
Yeah, we can do that. How about that? Just a little joke. I'm a member of lots of these cyberspace communities, and when you attend those and you talk, and there are a screen that people respond to it. So we usually say, if you can hear me, just send a 2. So number 2 shows that you are hearing me. So if you're hearing me, send a 2. In reality, obviously Iran is part of the Middle East, and fortunately by now all of you know where Middle East is. I usually start this type of talk with a little map that shows the kind of academic definition of the Middle East, and the terminology by itself is kind of indicative of the fact that it's a kind of a Western-centric approach to the world. And so everything is east or it's west, and so that's where the middle of east exists. And Iran is part of that area, which includes North Africa, and goes for some reason, it used to end at Iran, but now, apparently, because we all have some sort of joint destiny, now also includes Afghanistan and Pakistan. They used to kind of call Afghanistan as part of the Central Asia, and oftentimes Pakistan as the subcontinent in Asia. But now we are all together. So how we came to be part of this destiny and this story obviously started with the exploration of oil. So most of us have the definition to the Western world and Western capital for having oil. And I'm afraid when that commodity ends, then there won't be any importance for the region. And countries such as Iran and the rest of the Middle East can sleep well at night and not be afraid for the next day of what is going to bring to them. Up until around 1960s to 1965, a barrel of oil was basically sold in a 76 cents a barrel price for a long period of time. And compare that with $70, $80, $100, $150 a barrel these days. And that basically causes the reason for so much trouble that we face in the Middle East. In 1953, an Iranian national elected Prime Minister, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, was a nationalist. He, with the help from labor unions and basically the left and intellectuals in the country, who shortly before that has come from mostly studies in left, in West, in Paris, and he was a Sorbonne graduate, Dr. Mossadegh. He went after nationalization of the oil, and Iranian oil was the first to be nationalized. Timely, this actually coincides with some national movement in Mexico for nationalization of the resources. The British government and the British Petroleum Company could not tolerate a change of this magnitude. Basically, they just got used to free oil and were enjoying it, and they were not able to understand that the owner of the oil is by itself a country or has its own identity and has the right to the resources. This was not acceptable, and you still hear this is true when they say it's our oil under their land. In fact, that's how Brits basically dealt with it. And at the time, the American President Truman didn't want to interfere with this fight between Iranians and British government and British oil company, which was by definition more stronger than the British government itself. So Iran got into a fight, and they kind of put an embargo around Iran, and Iran could not basically sell the oil and could not do anything, just similar to what's happening in the past 33 years, and all the sanctions that it appears to be totally acceptable by the West and the people that are supporting it. The misery that caused inside the country basically caused some defection from the National Front. And that was a good time for Americans, which has just elected a Republican president. And they have come back and they gave support to British government, and they sent a couple of CIA operatives to basically design and execute a coup d'etat against Dr. Mossadegh. And in 1953, in August of 1953, a coup d'etat basically ended up with overthrowing the government. And for the next 25 years, Iran was run by a monarch that was basically a pawn in the hands of the American imperialism. Those days, before 1953 coup d'etat in Iran, the Americans were perceived in Iran and elsewhere in the world as the powers of peace, as the powers of modernity, in a sense. This was the very beginning of a shift in foreign policy, which continued with all kinds of occupation in Latin America, in Panama, in Guatemala, in all over the world. There were coups after coups after coups, basically infiltrated by CIA, and caused basically the situation that we are in now. If at that time an Iranian democracy was allowed to flourish, the situation in the Middle East would have not been the same as what it is today. All the problems that we face basically comes back to a decision that was made in 1953. And not only me, but also many American researchers do agree with the fact that if in 1953 US has not interfered with Iranian life and Iranian independency, the situation in the Middle East would be totally different. In 1979, when the Islamic Revolution in Iran basically was able to overthrow the monarch, as I just mentioned, what happened in Iran was, it was a kind of a long period. Let me step back a little bit and tell you that the life of Iranian movement for democracy goes more than 120 years today. And this, I guess, struggle has continued over these 120 years with different shapes and different movements. What brings us to these decades, the recent decades of Iran and the struggles with the West, starts in 1979. I'm not in a position, and I don't want to defend the Iranian regime at the moment. But the fact of the matter is, Iran decided, the people in Iran decided in a unit voice, they decided to cut the dependency to the West. And they decided that they want to have a country of their own. This notion is not acceptable by the imperialism, because the imperialism needs obedience everywhere, especially where there are resources. All you hear about nuclear issues with Iran, a nuclear bomb, or all kinds of things that are happening in the Middle East, and I'm not going to list them for you, are basically a facade for something else. After the Islamic Revolution in Iran, 8 years of war was imposed. You must have heard of Iran-Iraq war. It was not instigated by Iran, it was instigated by Iraqi government, and continued for 8 years with about 1 million casualties in both countries, 500,000 deaths in Iran, 500,000 or more deaths in Iraq. The destruction of most of the urban areas west of Iran and east of Iraq. The destruction of infrastructure, water facilities, oil refineries, all kinds of things, bridges, roads. And the life of, at that time, 40 to 50 million people in Iran basically was a process of daily attacks. At that time, I was living in Iran, and there was really no assurance that you will get up next day. You would go on the street, there was these missiles attacking. You could not even see it, an airplane. It was an airplane coming. It was a missile with 5 minutes warning, and then there wasn't enough shelters for people. We used to tell each other that, I had relatives in the US that they would call and ask, well, is it scary when you hear this explosion? And I was a structural engineer at the time in Iran, and we used to go and do inspection after the explosion. And it would basically destroy a whole block. A block of city would go with one of these missiles. And my response to this question of, is it scary? Is it sounded? Is it loud? Is it this? Is it that? And the answer was no. If you hear the sound of explosion, it means you're alive. So that's basically the level of destruction and demonization of the people, basically. And unfortunately, this story continues in different shapes and in different fronts, and we don't have really any response to it. Especially now that I am part of this Western society, I feel helpless. Because when these things happen in our daily life, and we send our troops under Republican president or Democratic president, it doesn't really matter. That's the structure that continues to destruct the rest of the world without any regard for humanity, without any regard for what is happening and what is bringing to their people. At some point, people would just say, enough is enough, I have had it. And this is what happened in the countries that now we are talking about Arab Spring. In Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, and now in Syria, in Yemen, in Bahrain. Most of these countries, they had puppets running their country. At some point, people just decided that they've had enough of it and they want to change it. Unfortunately, in many of these situations, even that change becomes a play, becomes like a theater that someone else is designing it and it's happening that way. You don't see really much of change on those countries that, fortunately, they had, for example, their change. In Tunisia, the most promising of the whole group. In Egypt, nothing has changed. And then it comes to Syria, and it appears that even the foreign policy advocates of this government, they're just clueless of what's happening in that country. And they don't want to give it up. Just say, I don't know, you guys go do it. No, you don't hear that. Everybody appears that they have the most intimate information about what's happening in Syria, and at the same time, they have no clue. They don't have FSU. That's what's happening in the Middle East these days. And then there are these establishments. In many of these situations, you see them following the petrodollar that comes from Saudi Arabia and Qatar. They follow it. It's totally, I guess, unbelievable that people are coming out of a shadow and go to the dark. And we here we're just admirers of whatever. It's exotic. for us to look at what's happening in those countries. We have think tanks lecturing us about what to do in Egypt, what to do in Syria, what to do in Libya. The students of the School of Strategic so-and-so in Maryland, they gave themselves the right to dictate what is the right way to go, or what is the correct way to do it. People in those countries, I believe, have got to a point that they understand their own situation better than anybody else, from any university or educational world or whatever think tank, you name it. The solution, the work, and basically the map that they want to follow is all indigenous. And they need to basically go into their own inside and find a way out. Our design and our roadmap is just, it's not even working for ourselves, let alone be working for them. The people in Egypt, the people in Iran during the Green Movement in 2008, 2009, you might have remembered. All of a sudden, people on CNN, they realized, oh yeah, it's possible that somebody with a cell phone can capture the image that the freaking CNN with satellite cannot get it. Yeah. Yeah, people become basically, they have to come up with the ways, with the means of their own. They know what they have in their hand. They know what they can use. They know what turn is after this turn, not us here. So I believe that we need to really stay back from trying to teach what to do in the Middle East, and more try to observe the decisions that are made within those societies. As Nat suggested, I would go into a little more detail about the relation between Iran, specifically with Arab Spring, the countries that have had uprisings as part of the Arab Spring, as well as talking a little bit about the Israeli conflict and how Iran became the major obstacle for the policy. The first question is basically, what is wrong with Iran? And what is this whole 30 years of a struggle that West and the United States specifically faces with Iran? The only thing goes back to what I told you at the beginning. Iran wanted to be an independent state. And there are hegemonies that are being threatened in the Middle East. Iran appeared to have some influence in all of these little islands in the Middle East. It started in the 1980s. When Israel occupied Lebanon, it was Iranians who started helping the Shiites, because unfortunately it becomes a religious war in a sense. Because, for example, the Turkish Prime Minister doesn't care if the Shiites in Lebanon are being under bombardment, but cares about Sunnis in Syria. Similarly, the Iranian government cares about the Hezbollah in Lebanon, but it doesn't care about Sunnis in Syria. And that's basically what when you bring religion into the whole game. Unfortunately, that's the case. Otherwise, the Shiites and Sunnis lived there for 5,000 years. Muslims and Jews lived for 5,000 years. The Christians, the Armenians, they lived in Iraq, in Iran, in Syria, in Lebanon for 5,000 years. But now, we had this war for 20 years in Lebanon between Christians, between Shiites, between Sunnis, and still there are bombings and territories under influence of one or the other. In Iran, I went to school with many friends that were Armenian and Jewish. One of my best friends, he was Jewish. We didn't have any of these. We were actually a kind of, some of us, were jealous or envied them because they didn't have to come to the religious class. No offense to religious people here, though. But anyway, what I want to emphasize on is that really the relation between Iran and these different countries, as I said, Iran didn't have any influence on what happened in Egypt or in Tunisia or even in Libya. But there are apparently some connections to the movement in Bahrain and to the movement in Yemen. Because they can basically call it as a sectarian uprising or a sectarian war. So it is acceptable to say, for example, what Bahraini Sheikh says, that Bahrain uprising is just an infiltration of the Iranian government. Or everybody is a spy for this country or the other country. It is difficult for them to understand that at least some of the reason is themselves, is how they have run those states. When you have a Bahrain that has 90% Shiite population and they don't have any right, obviously something would come up somewhere. Or Saudi Arabia. If you have a kingdom with 30 million people living there, so much resources, so much fund and money, but you deny the people in areas that are basically the oil land, the eastern part of Saudi Arabia, mostly populated by Shiites, oil goes out and they don't get anything back from it. So you would expect some uprising to happen. It doesn't need an Einstein to tell you that there's something wrong in this picture. So there are these connections, but it all goes back to, what do you want to call it? You want to call it imperialism? Call it imperialism. You don't want to call it something else. But there is a love, a passion for hegemony. It's just a masculine type of exposing yourself on a society. And unfortunately, it would have a response from that society. They're not going to continue take it. And it gets to a point that you have to basically move on. And this is what's happening with Arab Spring. I can stop here and maybe that help organize some sort of dialogue.
Okay, so what we're going to try to do here is have maybe something a little bit different from just question, answer. I'll take 2 or 3, maybe 4 questions at a time. We'll hand it over to Goudarz. He'll weave the themes together, and pontificate a little bit, and then we'll go back to some more questions. Feel free to ask a question. Also feel free to answer a previous question that's come up in the audience. If you have a question,
If you have a comment,
oh sure, or any comments, exactly. If you have a question, just raise your hand. If I nod at you, it means you can put your hand down. I've got you on the list, and you've got the first one.
So I blog occasionally for a site called the Muslim Network for Baha'i Rights. But the reason why it's been updated so infrequently lately is because most of the articles that we write, when it comes to the rights of Baha'is in Iran, we find on very Islamophobic, right-wing, neocon websites, as this is justification for further aggression against Iran. Do you have any suggestions or comments on how to condemn these severe human rights abuses in Iran, while not feeding, adding fuel to that fire?
Maybe kind of along the human rights question, I'd like to just hear more about the green movement in Iran. Where is that, the human rights movement that we heard so much about a few years ago?
Okay, and let's just start with those two. I think there's plenty there.
Yeah, I think that both are very intertwined, and the first thing is that to understand what is going on in Iran and the government in Iran, on the side of what I just said about their wish for being independent, the fact and reality is that Iranian government is a theocratic regime. And because of that theocracy, they have totally different opinions about human rights, specifically when it comes to the religious rights. They have devised these terminologies of the Islamic human rights. When it comes to universality of human rights, they basically reject it. So that's the government that you're dealing with. And the oppression includes not just Baha'is, but also Zartushtis, the Jewish, the Christian, and Muslims. The Sunni Muslims in Iran are oppressed. You cannot find a Sunni mosque in Tehran, the city with 13 million people. It's not allowed to have a prayer for the Sunnis in Tehran. So these are the realities of the situation in Iran, and I am not in a position to defend it. The Iranian government does not have a good record for observance of human rights. Specifically, as I said, for minorities, specifically for Baha'is that are not considered even a religion by the Iranian government. The Iranian government accepts the Abrahamic religions, but it does not accept Baha'is, nor does it accept Buddhism. They only accept Zoroastrianism because it was a Zoroastrian country when it was invaded by Arabs for 1400 years ago. That's the only exception. Other than that, the only religions that are accepted in Iran officially by the government are Abrahamics. Christians, Jewish, and that's it, and Islam. And as I said, even the sect of, even the Sunni faction of Islam is not fully understood and accepted. In the Sunni areas, they do have Sunni mosques, they do have Sunni prayer leaders, but in the mostly Shiites, they don't even allow them to do their Eid prayers, which is basically something that is very sank to them to have. So, Iranian government, as I said, doesn't have a good record for human rights because they don't really accept the universality of human rights. They tag most of the accepted norms of universal human rights as the Western human rights. So the right of women in some aspects of it is not tolerated. And so they, basically for them, for the Iranian government, their understanding and their reading of Islam is the defining point for religion. With the Green Movement, the only, I guess, answer that I can say is that the leaders of the Green Movement are still under house arrest. They do not have access to outside world for any kind of communication. Once or a month, or even sometimes 2 or 3 months a time, they allow their daughters, actually Mr. Musavi has 2 daughters, that they cannot even see their parents except for like every 2 months or every 3 months. One of them being allowed to go and visit the parents. So they are totally blocked off. Their house is basically walled off, and the security forces are controlling their house. As far as the movement itself, after the harsh treatment of them, after arrest of 4,000 to 5,000 of their activists, eventually, probably some of them are out of the prison, but there are more than 2,000 still in prison, and they have not been allowed to participate in a democratic society. The presidential election is coming up in June, end of June, and still there is no sign that they would allow anybody from the reform movement or the Green movement to take part in the election and be a nominee or candidate. Because as you may know, the Iranian system of government, as I said, is a theocratic republic, and they also have a body that vets basically the candidates for any kind of election. Congress election, presidential election, city and state council elections. They vet them. Even they vet the doctors that they want to become part of the council of physicians. They have to be approved by this guardian council. And because of that, obviously, nobody from outside the closure of the leadership echelon cannot get through to be able to participate.
Yes, in the black and
Yeah,
white
I
sheet.
just have a question. If you see any movements that of dissent that might, with masses of people that might start in Iran, like in Egypt or Tunisia.
Question of dissent. And back in the corner.
I read once that when Saudi Arabia nationalized their oil, they reimbursed the oil companies for the huge investments they made in the oil infrastructure and gave them some kind of role in the distribution and refining, and that Iran and Iraq just seized. Have you ever? I did read it in Aramco magazine. Might be a little biased, but.
And let's take one with Saida.
Okay. I guess this is a question, a comment to both, but the discussion about Iran and its intolerance to religious minorities, Muslim religious minorities, yes, I it's great that we discussed it, but I also think it's important that we keep in mind that Sunni majority countries, so-called Muslim Sunni majority countries, do the same thing. When it comes to women's rights, religious minorities, this is a global topic. Here, even I consider myself a religious minority, and although there are so much laws out there that's supposed to protect me, in fact, I was just walking down, I'm a student here, I was walking down PSU campus, and I'm being called names every day. And there are no laws that are protecting me from these people. In fact, I don't even feel safe walking along. So, I mean, these things are global, have history, and I'm not necessarily supporting the Iran government. I really don't know much about it, but I think it's not unfair to just focus on Iran and say this is what Iran is doing because everybody else is doing it. So,
Okay, let me answer these 2-3 questions and then I'll get back. I appreciate your comments. As I said at the beginning, a requirement for being neutral, religious neutral, is that you should not be a religious in public. Religion is a private belief. Once that faith comes out, then you want to impose it on other people, then you will have conflicts with everybody. The Shiites with Sunnis, Sunnis with Shiites, Christians, and that's not anything new. At the same time, what we feel as how we are being treated in this society, it's obvious. I mean, I just said a clear example that we can be object of or subject of basically a lot of discrimination, and there's nobody here apologizing for it. And I'm not. I mean, what I said is the facts that exist. And as you said, again, I just in my little talk, I talked about the Bahrainis' discrimination against Shiites or Saudi Arabians' discrimination against Shiites. Even in this Egypt, after the revolution, they allowed a group of Iranians as tourists to travel to Egypt 3 weeks ago. But they put a exception on the right of tourists to travel within Egypt. They cannot go to Cairo's Shiite mosques. There are several mosques in Cairo that are perceived a sanctuary for Shiites. But part of the giving them permission to have these tourist trips to Egypt is that if they go to Egypt, they cannot go to these mosques in Cairo. So there's really nothing to try to defend it. It's the fact of, unfortunately, when you have a region that has 124,000 prophets, then that's what you get. With regards to the movement in Iran, or if there is any chance for it, the Iranian society is very dynamic. When the reform movement happened in 1976, 1996, that nobody would expect something to happen within 3 weeks. When Khatami became a candidate for presidency in Iran, everybody thought that the next president would be the person who the religious leader Ayatollah Khamenei has appointed. So there was no expectation of something going on. But within 3 weeks, the youth and the mostly secular people, they created a situation that he was elected with 76% of the vote. So surprises is always part of the elections in Iran. Elections in Iran is not free. Don't fool ourselves. But surprises are always happening. amongst the people that have been, that have passed those vetting process, still there is a possibility that something may happen. And part of it is that the society is really not homogenized. It's an extreme volatile society that a lot of people from different opinions about everything, they are active in that society, and that is the only hope. And as I said, Iran has this pleasure of doing things that then later on was actually seen as a beginning of a movement. This green movement in 2009 is believed to have instigated the Arab Spring in many of these countries. At least because of the people that they saw something is happening. So that is the other thing. With regards to nationalization of oil, I really don't have much information about nationalization of oil in Saudi Arabia. What I know is that in 1953 or in 1950 era, when Americans and Aramco basically went to Saudi Arabia to sign a concession for the oil in Saudi Arabia, they agreed to share the profit 50-50 with the Malik Saud in Saudi Arabia. At the same time, in Iran, the Brits were taking out the oil and they were paying the Iranian government less than what they paid as a tax to British government. British Petroleum Company would explore the oil, pay a tax of 8% to the British government, but pay less than that, 5% to Iranian government.
Okay, in the green shirt and then the woman with the leather jacket.
My question was largely answered when you said there's this dynamic and there can be changes. It was just my question was, during the period of the Shah, which I remember, there were demonstratively pro-Western people, pro-Western lifestyle. And I can't imagine all these people fled, so they're still there. And clearly they're going to have desires, and then the expats, there's a tradition for that influencing what's going on. And that was just going to be my question, what are they going to play a role in changes? But you've already said there's this flux, unexpected stuff comes out, and that's probably a good enough answer to my question. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
So I do wanted to make some comments, and I'm also gonna pose 2 questions. One of the comments is like, when it comes to the human rights, I appreciate description. However, the human rights are not, it's very general term. And when it comes to Iranian women, they are considered to be the most educated women in this area. So even if we are looking into certain things, yeah, definitely it's improvement. However, there are certain things like the human rights in this country needs improvement as well. So my question would be, could you please describe Iran during the Shah time? And what's the difference between Iran during the Shah time and current regime? And how this current regime actually came to Iran? And then my second question would be, how the US banks' sanctions are actually destroying Iranian people and society, and how well Persian people are actually represented in the US media?
Very good questions. This can be basically a topic for another lecture.
I think so.
But let me actually combine these 2 last comments, yours and the gentleman's. See, during the Shah, Iran was moving toward modernity. But the modernity was not social. It was instrumental. Very similar to Saudi Arabia today. It was a glory for Shah to have the best airplane, to employ the best Western companies to come, the best architecture, the best, even the best artistic events. Iran at that time had an art festival in summer in the city of Shiraz, close to Persepolis, which people were coming, artists were coming from Paris and other capital of the West, that they did not at that time even get exposure in their own country. The type of plays and music, Stockhausen, the German modern musician, performed in Tehran in one of the last art festivals that nobody understood what he was playing. And he himself said, and actually I was at the performance, and he told us that the type of music that, I mean, he was using the term that at that time was eternity. In 21st century, the kind of music that you will be listening is not something that you listen on the radio or on the, at that time was gramophone. The music would be just the noise of a brake of the vehicle or an accident or a shot. Let's get used to these beauties of the sound. And that was the performance in 1979 in Iran. So these modernities, or these ideals of modernity, basically caused the problem because people were not in tune with it. Once, the second, and that was the major problem, was that Iran was moving toward a industrialized and top capitalist country without having a social elements of that society. There was no modernity in the social scene, in the social structure of the government. You didn't have any right in the governance of your country, but you had F-17s or F-16s, and at very last years, Iran had permission from Richard Nixon to purchase as much as they want. When Jimmy Carter became president, one of the conditions that Jimmy Carter became president was that the sale of arms to the countries that have bad records of human rights has to be approved by the Senate. So when Iran comes, and Shah used to travel to US all the time with these blank checks, he had this passion for buying things. And so he wanted the best and the one that no one else has it. Similar to what is happening right now in United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia. He wanted the best test. I don't know if that's the word. The most best airplane in the world. So he would come here and he wanted to purchase. And one of the reasons that they really hate Jimmy Carter, the monarchist, the Iranian monarchist, is because he said, well, you know, I know Nixon told you whatever you want you can buy, but let's have a talk. And that talk ended up the Islamic Revolution of 1979. So I don't know if I answered your question, but with regards to human rights as women, especially education, you are right. The women movement in Iran is one of the movements that has the most, and I guess the most significant achieved movement. And you will be surprised to know that the women that are active in the movement are actually religious people because they have overcome this. And the reality is that women in Iran during the Shah and after were part of the society, were part of the workforce. So it was impossible for the industry and for the capitalism to push them in the house. because they were part of the society. They were workers in industrial zone, scientifically active. University professors were women, educators and physicians, surgeons, everything. Engineers. You would be surprised that in this town, I know 20 Iranian female engineers. Most of them don't work. They have educated, they become engineers, but they run their own house life. So that's why more than 60% of Iranian higher education students are women. For them, getting that degree, going to the top level of the society is a challenge that they have to be victorious in it. But once they achieve that, they're not playing that role, the significant role that they should be playing after that. So yes, Iranian women are the most educated women that I can think of, and they are not limited to, okay, I actually interviewed Gretchen Kafuri, our own council member. She told me in 1965, when she was graduating from high school, the only work that she could do was nursing or going to school and teach. But at the same time, I knew many Iranian women who go to college and become an engineer and scientist. There are differences, but that doesn't mean that Iranian women are not oppressed. By legal definition, they don't have many rights. The Iranian women are always threatened of basically, for instance, if a woman wants to travel to outside the country, they have to get a permission from their either father or the husband. So this may not be really a very big deal, but in reality it shows the difference, because the men don't have to go get permission from their wives. So these are the kind of realities that exist.
Ziad?
Thank you. I would like I have a comment, because about the sectarian war. And in your speech, just you remind me with a book I read, The Political Islam for Samir Amin, and how is religion used by groups and classes and as an excuse. But what we see right now in the Arab world and the Middle East in general, it's something related long time ago, even before Psycho and Speaker, the way how they divided the Middle East. And the plan they had, the imperialist power, the imperial power, the way how they divided Middle East and keep this kind of buckets where in the future they can influence it and create this kind of war. Because the benefit for what's going on right now in the whole Middle East and North Africa, I can say it's just feed the people in power. Until now, they didn't feed the people in the ground. This is one comment. And the question for me, it's right now it's different, because you're supposed to speak about Iran and Palestine. You didn't have enough time, I know that. The connection, I'm a Palestinian, and all the time right now I see Iran and the Israelis, the way how they try to present Iran as the main threat for their future, and the way how United States play with that and the sanction. And I think she asked about the sanction, if it affects the Iranian people. You didn't answer. I hope you can answer that. I would like to know. But this kind of connection right now, how it will affect the future, how you see it it will affect the future. Every day when you hear the news there in the Middle East, you think the war is coming tomorrow, after tomorrow. After the election, they are waiting for the election. They want to see if Ahmadinejad will leave or will not leave, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, let me put the sanctions as part of the whole aggression against Iran. But to talk about the reason behind this sort of, I guess, atrocities that Israelis feel about Iranians and the Iranian government, vice versa, basically, is that Israel, to be honest, cannot stand any other competition in the region. And Iran has been able, in the past 30-some years, to, as I said, to not only be a kind of independent in foreign policy, but also have achieved some significant steps forward in industrialization, in developing all kinds of weaponries that they do, the missile systems, and eventually being able to enrich uranium. So the Iranian government claims that this enrichment of uranium is for peaceful purposes. And there is no indication that IAEA or any other international body has been able to find anything in the contrary. So for the documents that exist for people to see, there is nothing that says Iran has transferred enriched uranium to the military programs, or they are planning. The American National Intelligence Estimate says that in 2003, which coincides with the time Iraq invasion was, Iran has stopped its military program. So that's the NIE report, which has repeatedly came out the same way since 2006, for the first time when it was released. So there is really no indication that that shows Iran has used enriched uranium in anything except for the peaceful purposes. They, at some point for 3 years, they basically abandoned all the enrichment activities when the process of negotiation with European 3 was going on. And then after 3 years, when they did not really reach any agreement, which was a condition of the discussion was that they would unilaterally stop working on this enrichment, and in return they were expecting the continuation of negotiation would somehow allow for collaboration. Collaboration meaning Iran would open its nuclear facilities and invite West to come in and take part and do collaboration in developing what they needed, especially for medical purposes, the isotope that they needed for the research facility at Tehran University. And once they did not really reach any agreement and Ahmadinejad became president, they basically withdrew from the discussion and they renewed their effort in enrichment. And obviously, right now they have been able to enrich to 20% grade uranium. One of the discussion of recent, contention is that Iran has created a facility under the mountains near Qom, the city of Qom, which Israelis cannot bomb, and that's why they say you should stop working there and put it somewhere that we can bomb. Basically, that's what it is. That's the reality of the language. So they have put, first of all, Iran has been under sanction by the United States for 33 years. So there is no change in that regard. All things that have happened in the past year or so relates to Europeans' relation with Iran, economically and industrial. Iran has not been able to purchase any airplane for the past 33 years. All the airplanes that are going down are the airplanes that were purchased during the Shah. And the life of the people that are being killed in this incident really doesn't matter for anybody in the West. All the people who like human rights, they don't like human rights to life, in a sense. So that's basically what the situation is. With regards to Israel and Iran, as I said, it's the fight over the influence. If you remember, shortly after the Iraqi invasion, and basically when the competition between Saddam Hussein and Iran went away, they talked about a Shiite what's this?
Crescent.
Crescent, yeah. Shiite crescent. Because of the influence that Shiites now are gaining through Shiites in Iraq and the government of Alawites in Syria, all the way to Lebanon, the southern Lebanon. So they said, oh, now we are being basically surrounded by the Shiite crescent. And this was not acceptable to basically the stability of the region. And that basically started all these problems. Iran, well, obviously has been able to kind of punch a little bit here or a little bit there toward Israelis, including these drones that are traveling. These are actually, when we say drones, don't mistake it with the drones that we send in Afghanistan and kills people in Pakistan. These drones are a small airplane, mostly to surveillance. Basically are spying drones, the small one that you can order at Amazon.com probably, to take a picture of your neighbor's house. So that's the kind of spying drones that Iran or Hezbollah sends over Israel. I don't think they have really that type of possibility of infiltrating inside the Israel. The other part is that, again, it comes back to the fact that if there wasn't a, I guess, embargo on Gaza, there would have not been Mari Marmara traveling there to be killed by 9 Israelis. So the reason behind these conflicts goes to that occupation. So as long as you don't want to solve that problem, then you can't say, well, yeah, Mr. Obama travels to Israel. Oh, it's very sad. These missiles are coming every time I'm here, and people don't have life. Have you ever been across the board and have ever looked in Gaza, even from your airplane?
I'm Jeff from San Francisco. First, I really appreciate the comments you had beginning and throughout about, like, if we're going to want to try to understand what's going on or analyze what's going on in Iran or anywhere else, we have to first actually pay attention to what people there are thinking and doing and saying, because I think even on the left, people can have a kind of a condescending attitude towards the revolts that go on around the world and either say, well, this is an autocratic regime, so we really have a part to play in overthrowing it, or on the other side saying, well, this is an anti-imperialist regime, so therefore any opposition to it must be employed by the CIA, or it's counter-revolutionary, therefore we have to oppose it. I think I appreciate what you said about to look at the actual dynamism and of the movements there, and I know very little about it, so I don't want to attempt to comment. So again, I appreciate what you're bringing forth. I just wanted to raise again about this issue that you're just talking on, and U.S. threats and Israeli threats. And it is a little baffling to think, when I started paying attention to politics, it was around the Iraq War, and it was when the anti-war movement was up in arms of these allegations of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and that being the excuse and the pretext. And now we have Obama, threatening Iran over the threats of this, nuclear weapons, which, as you're saying, are not really there, which in itself is absurd. I mean, what do you make of the potential threats moving forward? And also, you commented a little bit on the sanctions issue. From what I understand, now that the EU and the UN are actually kind of on board with the US to an extent, apparently it has had a pretty big impact on the economy there. What do you think that, what kind of effect do you think that's going to have on the sort of green movement and the popular movement? Because I guess I could see it going either way. One, creating more animosity towards the U.S. and obedience or appreciation of the regime, or it could be more like, oh wow, now we're even more economically deprived, we hate imperialism and we hate the regime that's not helping us either, and lead to more Arab Spring style rebellion. What do you see happening as a result of that?
Let's take one more question. The orange shirt.
I just wanted to share some thoughts on the question of religion and religious conflict, because it seems to me like they're absolutely essential in having some clarity in political analysis. I wanted to build on some thoughts that the colleague here had. Oftentimes we talk about these religious conflicts as if this were a religious conflict, but these are really political identities and they have been long politicized. I mean, going at least as far as I know, to the mid-1700s through World War I, the rising powers encircling the Ottoman Empire used the fight ostensibly for the rights of religious minorities within that empire. Russia, England, Germany, France, etc., to start chipping away at the Ottoman Empire and politicize those identities. And after World War I, the French and the British established proxy regimes throughout the region, built on the basis socially of, in most cases, minority populations and many religious minorities. Wahhabis, Alawis, Jews, Maronites, etc., etc. So they set things up politically so that any popular upheaval against these minority autocracies would take a religious coloring or form, but these are primarily religious identities. Now, if this is a correct analysis, I would extrapolate that any fight for democracy in the region is really going to have to break from the trap where religion is a political instrument and is going to have to fight simultaneously for the separation of church and state power everywhere.
Let me talk about this shortly after I answered the sanction issue. But make sure, remind me to come back to it. I don't want to leave it. Yeah. That the sanction that is being discussed, especially in the Western media, there are all these commentators. It's working, it's not working, it's working, it's not working. The question really is, was it supposed to work? Was it designed to work? What was the goal? What was supposed to be achieved by sanctions? For 50 years we have had sanctions and embargo on Cuba. What has been the result of that embargo? And Cuba is basically an island, 90 miles from Miami, so there's really under our eyes 24/7. You can even see it. Iran is a 70 million country. It has a commodity that is sought by all kinds of countries in the world, from China, Japan, South Korea, India, which are basically the major players in the BRICS and in the economy of the world right now. They need the oil from Iran, and Iran has the oil for sale. So how can you really embargo this country with this potential? And the Iranian society is not a closed society like North Korea. North Korea is basically surrounded by military. Iran has some holes in this surrounding and is able to use those places to exchange. Until last year, the exchange of currency between Iran and United Arab Emirates was a phenomenon. They were purchasing everything from United Arab Emirates. Everything was actually shipped. Instead of being shipped to Iran, it was shipped to UAE, and from Dubai it would be shipped to Iran. So there is really no way that you can have a solid embargo around Iran. The other side of the problem is that what was the aim of the embargo and what was the aim of the sanction? In any country, I actually have done a research on 60–70% of sanctions that primarily the United States has imposed on different countries in the world. On 70% of them, they have not been successful. Either they ended up with a war, or they basically admit, and it changed. The prime example that they always give you is South Africa. South African model, actually now it's believed that prolonged the process. This is the most positive example for sanctions that we know is South Africa. But all the facts and all the, I guess, research that I have read now indicates that if this has not happened, because of the sanctions, the urban workers and the industrial workers were more impacted than the farmers and the farm workers. Farm workers technically are more conservatives and are going with the establishment, more so than the industrial workers and the urban cities population. So the people who were basically being impacted by sanctions on South Africa were the people that were supposed to be the forces of change. Similarly to in Iran, that's what is happening. The private industry in the country, the middle class in the country, is being impacted more so than the upper echelon of the government operatives, and they have the possibility to use all the funding that comes out of sale of oil to basically channel the money toward their own people. So they are benefiting. The intelligence ministry, the Revolutionary Guard, the people that are connected to the leadership of the government are the people that are benefiting from this. And because of the lack of funding, all the arts, all the science organization, they have all shut down. So the reality is that the sanctions have impact not proportionately, but the opposite in the negative of what the goal was. The goal was to change the situation. You are giving gift to the intelligence apparatus and the military apparatus to use those funds that now nobody else has. There was this competition between private entrepreneurship in the country and those connected to the government. Now it's totally reversed. The upper hand is in the hand of intelligence and the forces of basically close to the government and close to the military and security apparatus.
The other issue was revolutionary movements and the separation of church and state.
Right. I try to stay away from this discussion in a sense because I'm afraid it may offend some people. But in reality, you're absolutely right that as long as there are these connections between the state and religion, it's not easy to expect universal human rights achievements. But on the other hand, you cannot ignore the reality that some of these societies are religious indigenously. Genuinely they are religious. If you travel to Egypt, if you travel to Saudi Arabia, there are people that have these faiths and beliefs. People in Iran were the same way. And as long as you try to somehow mechanically deny them that potential of being in power, you are actually prolonging this whole process. In Iran today, majority of people, I would say, think totally opposite of what they thought in 1979. Majority of people in Iran in 1979, they were basically vowing for a religious state. They saw Ayatollah Khomeini in the moon. This is real. They said, it was the newspaper, that last night when the moon came out of eclipse, the image of Ayatollah Khomeini was there. So, now, 20, 30 years later, you have a majority of people that say, oh, we tried this, I don't think that's the way to go forward. The people from the government establishment, these reformists, the Green Movement, they all believe that it was a wrong decision in 1979 to change the constitution that was drafted before the revolution and put an item that makes a religious figure as basically the king. So this process for 30 years have created an environment that I am very hopeful that the next step of the next move in that country would basically result in a fluently democratic society. If the people in Egypt don't go through this, if people in Syria don't go through this process, they may accept something. They may accept what I just call the modernity of the Shah. But because it's not indigenous, it would not have the impact that people will feel with their bones and basically skins. So I believe that process, unfortunately, is a painful process, but it has to happen. What happened in Soviet Union and social bloc? 70 years later, it collapsed. That's what Marx said. Which I'm glad I bought this t-shirt.
So let me throw a question out to you that I think a couple of people have asked, and I'll give you a chance to say a little more about it. Connect, if you will, the Palestinian struggle to people in Iran. How important an issue is it to people in Iran?
Well, this is actually an interesting phenomenon in a sense because of the whole government and administration support for Palestinian cause, which I am not 100% sure that is a genuine care. You know, when Ahmadinejad comes and denies Holocaust, it's a game. It's a sham. So I'm not sure how much of what Iranian government claim is genuinely toward the Palestinians' right and their best of intention. At the same time, this perceived notion by many people inside the country has caused a sense of rejection. That some people in Iran now feel that, I mean, ironically, they feel that the money that could be spent on their own life is now being sent to Hezbollah, which, in my opinion, has really no rationale. If you know the numbers, you will know that the total amount that the Iranian government sends to Hezbollah is nothing compared to the budget that a 70 million population needs for life. But it's being perceived as if this was not, so that has caused some slogans in the streets in Iran that says, for example, no Gaza, no Lebanon, my life for Iran. So they feel that they have been somehow discriminated against. But the intellectuals of the country, the people who basically, and this is the populace, unfortunately, belief, but the intellectuals and the people who are active in the movement, they don't see it that way. They feel it as a joint struggle, and as I repeated several times, it is a struggle for influence and for continuation of occupation and for continuation of imperialist ideal of the Middle East.
We have time for one question. I'm going to call on someone that hasn't spoken yet.
She's been raising her hand for a long time.
All right, so since there are no other hands up, I think you've got it.
Okay, there we go. So I already actually, that was a question that I already posed, and you mentioned, like about, you already explained the sanctions. However, I wanted to know, in your opinion, how well, Iranian people are represented in the U.S. media, because you mentioned, like, when those sanctions happen, we know that a lot of people, they couldn't buy their food. And we could, the most people, they couldn't see this in the United States. So, how well Iranian people are represented in the US media and what you can do to improve that?
Well, that's basically the question that you can ask about anything in this country. The reality is that the media is not here to give you information of the real life. The media is here to advance a notion that is basically dictated from outside. And so how they perceive Iranian people and how they perceive the misery of the Iranian people and how they basically live their life is not their issue, it's not their topic. And that's why, I don't want to say that Kebu is the way to go. Because, how can Kebu compete with CNN and Fox? We can't. But if you are 80 people in this room that you want to listen to the news, and the real news and the real information, there are other ways to find it. And especially in the days of cyberspace and internet. I guess anybody, if you really want to know what Goudarz Eghtedari was going through, can find it in this world. And if you don't want to find the truth, just listen to Fox. That's all I can say.
All right.